The man known to history as Joachim von Ribbentrop was born on the 30th of April 1893 in the city of Wesel near the Dutch border in what was then the province of Rhenish Prussia in the Rhineland region of Western Germany. He was born simply as Joachim Ribbentrop. It was only when he was adopted by a relative with noble blood in later life that he became known as Joachim von Ribbentrop. His father was Richard Ulrich Friedrich Joachim Ribbentrop. Richard was an army officer, a lieutenant in the Westphalian Field Artillery, and his work ensured that the Ribbentrops travelled around quite a bit. As we will see, much of Joachim's ascent to political office in later life was based on his ability to speak several languages and his knowledge of other countries, faculties he developed early in life on account of his father's profession. His mother was Johanna Sophie Hertwig, who went by the name of Sophie. Together, she and Richard had 3 children. Lothar, the eldest, was born in 1890. Their second son, Joachim, was born in 1883, and a daughter, Ingeborg, arriving in 1896. The Ribbentrops moved quite a lot from very early in Joachim's life. When he was still a boy, they relocated to Castle Wilhelmshöhe, near the town of Kassel. In the late 19th century, it was not common for one to acquire a position as an officer in the German army unless one was possessed of a certain level of wealth. Lieutenant Richard Ribbentrop did not possess such wealth, and as such must have been unusually well qualified in order to attain this position. However, the fact that the Ribbentrops lived ensconced in a world of well-to-do military families, many of whom were members of the minor Prussian and German nobility, seems to have had a significant impact on Joachim during his youth, and he would spend much of his later life trying to acquire the trappings of wealth and nobility. This disposition as a social climber, which he acquired as a result of this upbringing, would one day go on to account for much of his desire to first join and then rise within Germany's Nazi Party in the 1930s. Joachim's childhood was also dysfunctional in other ways. His mother, Sophie, suffered from tuberculosis. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, tuberculosis was still a deadly disease with few known treatments. It was also contagious, a fact which saw Sophie Ribbentrop often spending much of her time in bed and away from her children, for fear of passing the disease to them. In the end, her efforts in this regard were unsuccessful. Her eldest child, Lothar, caught the disease and eventually died from it years later. It is also highly likely that Joachim became tubercular himself at a young age. Consequently, when he was 18 years old, one of his kidneys was removed, and it seems likely that this was to prevent the further spread of the disease through his system. This left Ribbentrop with a droop to one of his eyelids, which was related to the infected kidney. Beyond these personal health matters, the death of Lothar years later affected him badly. The pair had been close and relied on each other in a family dynamic where Lieutenant Ribbentrop was a cold and distant presence. As a result, in his late teenage years, Joachim was increasingly isolated as the family continued to move from place to place due to his father's reassignments to different bases and garrisons. In 1901, Richard Ribbentrop was promoted to the position of major, and the family was once again uprooted from Kassel to go and live in Metz, a town in eastern France today, but one which had become part of the German Empire in 1871, following the annexation of the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine by Prussia at the end of the brief Franco-Prussian War. The Ribbentrops remained here for the next 7 years. In 1902, Sophie Ribbentrop finally succumbed to her tuberculosis and died, following which Richard remarried to Olga Margareta von Prittwitz, an affable woman but one whom Joachim did not warm to. From 1904, when he was 11 years old, Joachim was sent to school in the Lycée Faber in Metz. Here he failed to excel. One teacher noted that he was overconfident in his abilities, and this confidence did not match his actual performance. At the end of one winter term, he came 32nd amongst a group of 50 boys, a performance which resulted in a beating from his father. However, despite his poor academic performance, others who remembered him from this time later related that Joachim did possess a level of charm which saw him get away with things that the other boys simply could not. This ability to ingratiate himself with his superiors, despite the lack of substance in his character, was one which he would utilize throughout his life. In 1908, a major shift occurred for the Ribbentrops. That year, Richard Ribbentrop resigned from the German Imperial Army. He had many doubts about the course of German policy under the rule of the Kaiser Wilhelm II, and a bout of conscience led to his resignation, which his commanding officers asked him to reconsider, but which he pressed ahead with anyway. Thereafter, the family entered a new period of nomadic wandering throughout Europe and even further afield. For a time, they lived in Switzerland, at the town of Arosa, followed by a brief stint in Britain, a country which Joachim developed an affinity for before they relocated to Canada in 1910. By now, Joachim was entering his adult years, and in the early 1910s, he took on a number of jobs while in Canada. For a while, he worked at the Molson's Bank in the city of Montreal, and then for an engineering firm which was engaged in rebuilding the Quebec Bridge over the St. Lawrence River. He also went south of the border and was briefly employed as a journalist in New York City and Boston. Throughout these years, Joachim was traveling widely and had also learned to speak English. His abilities with language and familiarity with a number of other countries in Europe and North America would become one of the main reasons behind his ascendancy in Germany many years later. The Ribbentrops were traveling around Europe and North America at a time when there was increasing tensions between some of the countries they were visiting. Joachim's own birth country, Germany, had been formed out of a few dozen smaller German states as recently as 1871. The new nation, which included both modern-day Germany and much of Western Poland, was quickly viewed as a threat by the other European powers, a rivalry that was compounded by the European powers scrambling for control of Africa and much of Asia. By the early 20th century, two major alliances had developed across the continent as a result of these tensions. One was headed by Germany and included the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Italy, while on the other side, Britain, France, and Russia had formed a triple entente. By the time the Ribbentrops were living in Canada, Britain and Germany were involved in a naval arms race, while Russia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire clashed in the Balkans, where both sought to secure greater influence during the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Thus, by the early 1910s, Europe was a powder keg and was on the verge of a major war. This tension finally spilled over in the summer of 1914. On the 28th of June, the heir to the Empire of Austria-Hungary, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by a Serb nationalist called Gavrilo Princip while conducting an official visit to the city of Sarajevo. A regional crisis developed between the Austro-Hungarians and Serbia, but this escalated when the government in Vienna made it clear that they wanted to intervene in Serbia's domestic affairs to conduct an investigation. Russia made it clear that it would move to support the Serb government, and during the course of July 1914, all of the other major European powers made clear their intention to also become involved if the situation escalated into military conflict. This is exactly what happened, and in early August 1914, an alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire ended up at war with Britain, France, and Russia. As these events unfolded, Ribbentrop was in Canada, a member of the British Commonwealth, and a country now at war with Germany. To avoid being detained as a German national, Ribbentrop crossed the border to the United States, where he quickly sailed from New Jersey back to Europe. Ribbentrop enlisted in the German Imperial Army upon his return to Europe. The war which followed between 1914 and 1918 was a strange conflict, much of it fought over a few miles of land in northeastern France, with other smaller fronts in the Alps and Eastern Europe. In his memoirs, written many years later, Ribbentrop described his war service as follows. 4 weeks after my enlistment, the first draft moved to the front regiment, but I was not considered worthy of inclusion. I thought the war would be over by the time I had got through my training, but in fact, I fought with this regiment until early in 1918, first on the Eastern and then on the Western Front, except when I was wounded and once when I was seriously ill. The last time I was wounded in the summer of 1917, I received the Iron Cross First Class. Another notable aspect of his time in service during the war was that towards the end of it, Ribbentrop became friends with a staff officer called Franz von Papen, an association which would have significant implications in later years. But for the time being, in 1917, the United States entered the war on the side of Britain and France. This tipped the conflict in favor of the Western European powers, and with domestic turmoil erupting within Germany, the Kaiser abdicated on the 9th of November 1918. 2 days later, an armistice was signed, and Germany accepted defeat in the conflict. The German Empire came to an end, and a new republic, named after the town of Weimar, was created. Despite the fact that his grandfather and father had both served as career army officers, Ribbentrop did not seek to remain in the military of the new Weimar Republic. Instead, he began a social ascent based on his relationship with Anna Elisabeth Henkel, whom he met for the first time in 1919, shortly after being discharged from the army. The Henkels were a wealthy German family with a large stake in the German wine industry. Through his marriage to Anna in the summer of 1920, Joachim was able to finally acquire the kind of wealth which he had been surrounded by in the moneyed officer class of the German Imperial Army during his childhood at Metz, although the Henkels generally disliked Ribbentrop and disapproved of Anna's choice of partner. However, in 1925, an aunt, Gertrude von Ribbentrop, agreed to adopt 32-year-old Joachim so that he could apply the nobiliary particle von to his name. Thus, Joachim Ribbentrop, the son of a middle-class officer who had struggled financially following his resignation from the army in 1908, had moved within a few short years of the war ending to become Joachim von Ribbentrop, a pseudo-noble and a wealthy member of a family of major German wine merchants. Thereafter, he settled into this upper-middle-class existence in the 1920s, living in Berlin and traveling across Europe selling the Henkel family wine. He and Anna also started a family, which would eventually result in 5 children. While Ribbentrop was selling wine around Europe, a political turmoil was gripping his homeland. In the aftermath of the war, many people in Germany were extremely disaffected. Hundreds of thousands of German men who had fought in the war found it egregious that Germany had accepted the humiliating terms of the Treaty of Versailles, with its stipulations that Germany must disarm and could not maintain any military presence in the Rhineland. Moreover, many Germans who had been career soldiers before the war found themselves out of work due to the reduced size of the German armed forces. Many of these individuals began gravitating to radical political parties in the post-war years. One of these, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, gained quite a following in Bavaria, and under its new leader, an Austrian called Adolf Hitler, even attempted a coup in Munich in November 1923. Although it was quickly suppressed, the Nazis, as they were known in short, would remain a feature of German politics. On the other end of the political spectrum, parties such as the Communist Party of Germany also had a large following during the 1920s. Thus, while the Weimar Republic was largely dominated by centrist parties such as the Social Democratic Party, the country could easily devolve into more extremist politics if the economic or political situation changed. This video is brought to you by our sponsor Omaze, who give away spectacular prizes while also donating money to charities all across the world. The prize Omaze are offering is the Tesla Model X Plaid, the supercar SUV in midnight silver metallic and a white interior. You could sit back in comfort while the tri-motor electric engine takes you from 0 to 60 in just 2.5 seconds. Enjoy the glass panoramic roof, 17-inch cinematic display, and 22-speaker surround system in a stylish Tesla supercar of your own. Entering for a chance to win helps to support 2.2 billion people around the world who do not have access to drinking water through Give Power, and helps build a cleaner, more sustainable future for the younger generation by bringing them energy, food, water, and shelter through 501c3. For your chance to win a Tesla Model X Plaid, Tesla's most sought-after flagship SUV, and support Give Power and 501c3. Go to www.omaze.com/thepeopleprofiles. Omaze and the People Profiles, bringing opportunity and history to life. In 1928, Ribbentrop became involved in this shifting political environment for the first time. He was introduced that year to Hitler through a mutual acquaintance. For the Nazi leader's part, he wanted to meet the wine merchant from Berlin, who had contacts within high society in the German capital, and also abroad. Perhaps he could be useful down the line. There is, though, nothing to suggest that Ribbentrop was any kind of swift convert to the Nazi cause. They met and parted, and it would be 4 years before Ribbentrop and his wife joined the Nazi Party. Moreover, throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s, Ribbentrop maintained very close relations with many members of the Jewish business community in Berlin. Certainly, the initial forays into meeting with the upper brass of the Nazi Party did not bring out any immediate anti-Semitic feelings which he might have harbored. Indeed, it is clear that in the early days of his involvement with the Nazis in the 1930s, Ribbentrop still believed that the party's anti-Semitic standpoint was a rhetorical device designed to strengthen German demands on territory in Eastern Europe. In time, he would come to see this belief for the delusion that it was. At the time of his initial meeting with Hitler in 1928, neither Ribbentrop nor anyone else could have imagined how central to the German political landscape the Nazi leader would quickly become. In the Reichstag elections of May 1928, the Nazis had received just over 2.5% of the national vote, and this had translated into just 12 seats in the 491-seat Reichstag. But this would all change in the years that followed. After the years of rampant international economic growth known as the Roaring Twenties, the stock exchange and markets on Wall Street in New York City began to take a hammering as the decade drew to a close in the autumn of 1929. Within a few weeks, the global economy was descending into a catastrophic economic recession, which became known as the Great Depression. Germany was hit particularly badly, and as the banking system teetered on the verge of collapse, Germans lost their jobs in droves, followed by their life savings. As feelings hardened in regards to the establishment parties which had run the Weimar Republic in the 1920s, suddenly the Nazis, communists and other radical political groups prospered at the polls. When new elections were held in September 1930, the Nazis became the second largest party in the country, taking nearly 20% of the seats in the Reichstag. During the early 1930s, things did not improve in Germany. Unemployment rose to nearly 30%, and many people were now resorting to barter as the Reichsmark had effectively lost all of its value. Thus, when new elections were held yet again in July 1932, these resulted in an even more polarized Reichstag. Now the Nazis were the largest party in Germany. Their message of resentment and anger had become increasingly popular, and they managed to secure 37% of the vote nationally, their best ever election result, and one which translated into 230 seats in an expanded Reichstag of 608 seats. However, this was not enough to secure power, and the rise of the Communist Party of Germany to secure third position and 89 seats in the Reichstag ensured that the parliament was split between right-wing and left-wing blocs. Clearly, the Nazis had the biggest mandate in the country, but they had not acquired a majority of the vote, and a great many people distrusted their motives and goals. In this impasse, the president, Paul von Hindenburg, elected to appoint a minority government of largely centrist and center-right independents. It was headed by Franz von Papen as chancellor, the former army officer whom Ribbentrop had met and befriended 15 years earlier during the First World War. This old connection would bring Ribbentrop into the center of the Nazi Party. Following von Papen's appointment as chancellor, he could not simply ignore the Nazis, for whom nearly 2 out of every 5 people in Germany had voted. But relations between the chancellor and the Nazi leader were tense, and they often needed intermediaries for their negotiations, one of the key aspects of which was discussion of how the further rise of the German communists could be avoided. Thus, in the early autumn of 1932, Ribbentrop, who had finally joined the Nazi Party on the 1st of May 1932, was requested to become involved in negotiations between the leader of the party he had just joined and his old acquaintance von Papen. Even at this point, Ribbentrop appears to have been a political moderate, and it seems clear that his full conversion to the Nazi cause occurred during the events of late 1932, which he was a central player in. When he arrived at the Berchtesgaden in Bavaria, he found Hitler to be very agitated with von Papen's unwillingness to concede the position of Chancellor of the Reich to him. But the Nazi leader explained to Ribbentrop that he was willing to enter into a coalition if this were allowed. Ribbentrop later claimed in his memoirs that by the end of the meeting, he had become convinced that Hitler was the only individual who could save Germany from the communist threat. While the negotiations in the autumn of 1932 had allowed Ribbentrop to move closer to Hitler, they ultimately failed. As a result, new elections were again called for in November 1932, just 4 months after the last national vote. In this, the Nazis and the Social Democratic Party both lost seats, the Nazi vote falling from 37% to 33%. The Communists gained, only marginally, but enough that Hitler was able in the winter of 1932 to further stoke fears that the left-wing parties were gaining at the expense of the right. Thus, when General Kurt von Schleicher became Chancellor in December 1932, negotiations were recommenced between Hitler, von Papen, and a coalition of political centrists and members of the business community to find an arrangement which could shore up the political system against the communists. Ribbentrop was central to these negotiations, and one of the key meetings was held at his home in Berlin on the 22nd of January 1933. Here, von Papen first conceded that he would support Hitler's candidacy to become Chancellor of Germany under certain conditions. The meeting at Ribbentrop's Berlin residence was the beginning of the end for the Weimar Republic, which had governed Germany since 1919. A week later, with von Papen and many others now urging him to do so, President Hindenburg finally appointed Hitler as Chancellor of Germany on the 30th of January. Within weeks, the Nazis moved to secure complete control of the state. New elections were called for on the 5th of March, with their paramilitary wing, the SA, terrorizing voters across Germany. The Nazis managed to win 44% of the vote, up 11% on the previous November. Moreover, days earlier, a fire had broken out in the Reichstag, and Hitler had blamed the event on communist subversives. He now used this incident in late March to pass an enabling act, which effectively allowed Hitler and the Nazi Party to rule by decree. Thus, the Weimar Republic was dead, within weeks of Hitler being appointed as Chancellor, and Ribbentrop would soon be rewarded for his role in bringing about Hitler's ascent. He now became a close confidant of the Chancellor, one who was well liked by Hitler on account of his willingness to consistently agree with Hitler's ideas, and also because of the Nazi leader's belief that Ribbentrop's travels in his younger years made him well qualified to comment on foreign policy matters. This quick ascent into Hitler's good graces in 1932 and early 1933 saw Ribbentrop gaining official appointments as a diplomat for the new Nazi regime. In the early years of the regime, much of Ribbentrop's focus was on the issue of German rearmament. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had brought the First World War to an end, Germany was required to drastically scale back its army and virtually dismantle its air force and much of its navy. The Nazis were committed to overturning this situation as soon as they entered government, and in 1934, Ribbentrop was appointed as a special commissioner by Hitler in relation to the disarmament issue. By the autumn of 1934, he was running his own bureau known as the Dienststelle Ribbentrop, or the Ribbentrop Bureau, parallel to the German Foreign Office, overseen by the Foreign Minister Konstantin von Neurath, a legacy foreign minister who had been appointed in 1932, before Hitler assumed power. In the mid-1930s, Ribbentrop was responsible for conducting diplomacy with France, Britain, and other European nations to convince them that Germany wanted peace, even as the country was rapidly rebuilding its military, navy, and air force. Ribbentrop gained a further promotion in 1935 when he was appointed as the Reich Ambassador Plenipotentiary at Large, a position within the German diplomatic corps that was only subordinate to the foreign minister. In this capacity, Ribbentrop oversaw the negotiations surrounding two diplomatic agreements which Nazi Germany entered into in 1935 and 1936. The first of these was the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which was arrived at in June 1935. Through this, Germany agreed, in theory, to keep the tonnage of its navy, the Kriegsmarine, at 35% of that of the British Royal Navy. This agreement was drawn up at a time when Hitler strongly believed that an alliance with Britain was still possible, and was also entered into as a supposed gesture of goodwill by the Nazis to convince Britain and France to agree to dispense with other aspects of the Treaty of Versailles. As part of these negotiations, Ribbentrop used the ploy that Germany wanted restoration of the colonies it had possessed in East Africa prior to the First World War as a bargaining tool to bring about the agreement. In the long run, the agreement was perhaps most significant in terms of the limited British reaction 9 months later in March of 1936, when Germany remilitarized the Rhineland region of Western Germany, which it had been prohibited from doing under the terms of Versailles. The second international agreement which Ribbentrop orchestrated at this time was the Anti-Comintern Pact. This was finalized in November 1936 between Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan. The full title of the treaty was the Agreement Against the Communist International, and it was effectively a coalition of right-wing governments against the Soviet Union. Benito Mussolini's Italy joined in 1937, followed by General Franco's new fascist regime in Spain in 1939, as well as Hungary. The agreement was politically important for subsequent events, as it moved Germany and Japan, and later Italy, closer together in ways which would have major consequences once the coming war began in 1939. It also signaled the full ascent of von Ribbentrop as Germany's senior diplomat. Von Neurath remained as foreign minister, but he had favored a pro-China stance in terms of the conflict in the Far East, which had been underway between China and Japan since the early 1930s. Thus, Ribbentrop's negotiation of the Anti-Comintern Pact highlighted that von Neurath was now a lame duck minister, and Ribbentrop was the real power in terms of the oversight of foreign affairs within the Nazi regime. In August 1936, just as the Anti-Comintern Pact was being concluded, Ribbentrop was appointed as Germany's ambassador to Britain. Hitler had commanded him to try to forge good relations in London with a view to carving out an alliance between Britain and Germany. This seems, in retrospect, like a strange hope for the German Chancellor to have had in the mid-1930s, but it is in keeping with Hitler's racial views. He viewed the British people as being a fellow Aryan people, who were nearly as racially advanced as the German people. From this perspective, they were a natural ally for Germany, and Hitler considered it to simply be rational that the British would eventually seek to ally with Germany against the communist Slavs of Eastern Europe and other groups that the Nazis viewed as racially inferior. These assumptions were to have a long life in Germany, and, in part, also explains Hitler's decision years later to turn eastwards against Russia in 1941, without first conquering Britain. He simply believed that eventually Britain would end its recalcitrance and ally with Germany against the Soviet Union. Thus, Ribbentrop's mission in 1936 was to sound out an alliance while also explaining away increasing German aggression in Central Europe. Armed with these lofty goals, Ribbentrop headed for London and arrived there in October 1936. His tenure as German ambassador to Britain would last a year and a half and would consist of one diplomatic incident after another. For instance, while visiting Durham Cathedral in November 1936, he mistook some organ music for the German national anthem and gave a Nazi salute, a gesture he repeated when he met King George VI in February 1937. More worryingly, Ribbentrop chose to focus his diplomatic attentions on convincing Britain to either join the Anti-Comintern Pact or return Germany's former colonies in East Africa, the latter being an issue Hitler had no interest in, and which had simply been used as a bargaining chip in the negotiations leading up to the Anglo-German naval agreement. All of these initiatives were dead ends, and by mid-1937, Ribbentrop was generally seen as unintelligent by senior British officials or was thoroughly disliked for his personality. The feeling was mutual, and a year after his appointment as ambassador, Ribbentrop had grown to despise his British hosts. Moreover, he was now beginning to see the alliance with Japan and Italy as something which should be directed against Britain, and that if needs be, an alliance with the Soviet Union should be sought instead of one with London. By 1937, Ribbentrop was considered such a liability by his own staff and members of the British Foreign Office that many people were actively trying to keep him away from London as much as possible in order to avoid any further diplomatic gaffes. One method of doing so was to send him to the English West Country, areas such as Cornwall and Devon. This particular development was to have a bizarre afterstory. Ribbentrop visited here on several occasions during his time in England and stayed on occasion there with Colonel Edward Bolitho, the Lord Lieutenant of Cornwall. There, Ribbentrop developed a deep affection for the region around St. Michael's Mount and St. Ives. Such was the appeal of this part of England, the sunny southwest of the country, that he apparently began petitioning Hitler that at some future date when Britain had been conquered or forced into a junior position within an alliance, that Ribbentrop would be given some of the castles and manor houses he had seen around the West Country, and that he would also be granted Cornwall as a sort of private fiefdom. Hitler had apparently agreed, and Ribbentrop actually began telling people in Cornwall in 1937 that he would one day be the lord of their shire. Interestingly, this would also seem to account for why Cornwall was generally avoided during German bombing missions over Britain during the Blitz of 1940 and 1941. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of Ribbentrop's desire to become Lord of Cornwall was that it indicates that he may have hated being in London so much at this point that he viewed the West Country as an idyllic sanctuary. By late 1937, he wanted out of his position as ambassador, and the opportunity to leave finally arose in 1938 when a series of scandals within the German military were used by Hitler as the pretext for removing officials who had been in office prior to 1933. Among them was the Foreign Minister von Neurath. When von Neurath was removed on the 4th of February 1938, Ribbentrop was appointed as his successor. He came into office just as Nazi Germany's stance in Europe was becoming more and more hostile. Following rearmament and the remilitarization of the Rhineland between 1933 and 1937, the next goal was to achieve superiority in Central Europe. The first step towards this was achieved in March 1938, when Hitler applied military and political pressure on Austria to ensure that the Anschluss, the unification of Germany and Austria into a Greater Germany, was achieved. Ribbentrop, who had just succeeded as foreign minister, did not play a key part in this, but he would in subsequent diplomatic negotiations prior to the outbreak of the Second World War. The first of these initiatives concerned German claims on the Sudetenland, a part of Czechoslovakia with a very large ethnically German population. No sooner had Nazi flags begun flying in Vienna than Hitler and his associates began pressing their claims on the Sudetenland to Britain and France. As diplomatic tensions over the region escalated in the summer and early autumn of 1938, a diplomatic conference was arranged at Munich in September 1938. Germany's foreign minister made an effort at this time to limit Ribbentrop's involvement, as he was deemed too inclined to go to war with Britain, a country he had grown to despise following his ambassadorial tenure there. Thus, Ribbentrop played a limited role in the Munich conference, one which resulted in Britain and France acquiescing to Hitler's demands for the Sudetenland, if he agreed not to seek any further territorial gains in Europe. Ribbentrop did become involved directly afterwards, however, when Hitler and the foreign minister quickly rubbished the agreement and used a mixture of military threats and diplomatic pressure to annex the rest of Czechoslovakia in March of 1939. Ribbentrop was nearing the height of his powers at this time, as Hitler had finally realized that an alliance with Britain was impossible, and war with them, which Ribbentrop was eager for, was inevitable if Germany was to continue to expand. Ribbentrop was central to several other diplomatic moves in late 1938 and early 1939. For instance, in mid-March 1939, just as Czechoslovakia was being annexed, Ribbentrop was responsible for contacting the Lithuanian government and demanding that it relinquish control of the city of Memel and the surrounding area, which had formed part of Germany prior to the First World War. If they refused, Ribbentrop stated, the city of Kaunas, the second largest in Lithuania, would be bombed to the ground. Thus, with a phone call, Ribbentrop acquired this territory for the growing Third Reich. However, in other areas, his blunt approach was far less successful, notably regarding Turkey. Germany was seeking an agreement with the regime there in 1939 to provide it with an ally in the Eastern Mediterranean for the coming war, but Ribbentrop's approach was so heavy-handed that he managed to drive the government there into agreeing a deal with Britain and effectively remaining neutral in the Second World War that would soon break out. However, his failure here was tempered by the finalization of the Pact of Steel in May 1939, whereby Germany and Italy further solidified their political and military alliance. Ribbentrop's foremost political and diplomatic success came a few months later. Ever since his disastrous spell as German ambassador to Britain, Ribbentrop had been convinced that the British were Germany's foremost enemy, and that if necessary, an alliance should be sought with the reviled Bolshevik government of the Soviet Union against London. Now, during the course of 1939, he had been engaged in discussions with his counterpart in Moscow, the Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, to that effect. Despite Fascist Germany and Communist Russia being ideological enemies, a deal offered considerable benefits to both sides. For Germany, it would neutralize the threat of war with Russia for some time, so that Hitler could concentrate on defeating Britain and France in Western Europe once war broke out, as it almost certainly would once Germany moved against Poland. Similarly, the experience of its unofficial conflicts with Japan since the mid-1930s around Mongolia and Manchuria in the Far East had demonstrated to the Russian leader Joseph Stalin just how unprepared for a major war the Soviet Union was. Moreover, an agreement would allow the two nations to effectively carve up Poland between them, while Russia could move into Finland and Germany into several other regions. The exact course of the negotiations are not precisely clear, as they were necessarily conducted in secret early on, but by the early summer of 1939 they were well advanced. It was clear that the negotiations were conducted on the understanding that Germany would soon be at war with Poland. In fact, the agreement between Berlin and Moscow was only formally concluded less than 2 weeks before Germany invaded Poland, and clearly Hitler had been waiting for an agreement to be reached before moving against Germany's eastern neighbor. Thus, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, named after the foreign ministers who negotiated it, was concluded on the 23rd of August 1939. Its main terms, as advertised to the international community, were that it was a guarantee of peace between Germany and the Soviet Union, but equally significant was the secret protocol kept private between the two nations. This involved a division of the countries lying between Germany and Russia, between the two powers, once the war began. Poland would be divided up, with Germany taking its western half and the Soviets the east, while Germany would also control Lithuania, leaving Estonia and Latvia for the Soviets. Another clause allowed for the Soviets to invade and occupy Finland, on the understanding that Germany would soon be occupying territories in Western Europe. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement sent shockwaves throughout the international community. After all, fascism and communism were ideological opposites, and much of Nazi rhetoric over the years had been about the coming clash with the Bolsheviks of Russia. Britain and France were taken especially by surprise, as in their preparations for war with Germany, they had assumed that following a German invasion of Poland, Hitler would be faced with the difficulty of having the Soviet Union on his eastern border. This risk was now diminished, and Britain and France's position was weakened considerably as a result. All of this was in the context of continued German demands on Polish territory, which were intended solely to provoke war. In response, Britain hastily put together a defence pact with Poland and announced it on the 25th of August, 2 days after the announcement of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement. However, this did nothing to deter Hitler. On the 1st of September, after a false flag event designed to provide some surface justification for the enterprise, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany in response. 2 weeks after that, the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland in order to occupy the area agreed to with Germany in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement. The success of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement and the invasion and occupation of Poland, which occurred in the weeks that followed, saw Ribbentrop rise to a position of considerable power within the Nazi regime. His star would remain in the ascendant for the next 2 years. His diplomatic coup with the Soviets was the background against which Germany launched the Second World War, and, in its early stages, that war went extremely well for Germany. Following the conquest of Poland in late 1939, the Nazis turned north and west, conquering Denmark and Norway in the spring of 1940, and then roaring westwards into the Low Countries and France in the early summer. By the autumn of 1940, the Blitz of Britain from the air and efforts to strangle the country through a naval blockade of the North Atlantic were underway, and Nazi flags were flying everywhere, from western France to Warsaw in Poland. Ribbentrop's agreement with the Russians had provided a window for the Nazis to quickly conquer much of mainland Europe. Consequently, the German foreign minister reached the peak of his powers between 1939 and 1941, with Hitler holding him in extremely high regard throughout this time. The early 1940s saw Ribbentrop largely handling affairs with Germany's allies in the war. With the conflict now fully underway, the time for negotiations with countries like Britain and France was over. A more pressing issue was getting Italy to honour the Pact of Steel and join the war, which it eventually did in June of 1940. Once this occurred, Ribbentrop was involved in efforts to occupy the various nations of the Balkans through diplomatic pressure. This attempt failed, however, and the region was jointly invaded by Germany and Italy. There were also concerns about the situation in the Pacific, where Germany's ally Japan was becoming ever more jingoistic in its approach to the United States. From 1940 onwards, Ribbentrop was working towards the failure of negotiations between the two Pacific powers, and for Japan to attack America. In contrast to his shrewd analysis in 1939 that an accord with the Soviets was advisable, this latter view on America showed very poor judgment on Ribbentrop's part, and when Japan eventually attacked America in December 1941, it brought the United States into the war in ways that would tip the balance of the war in favor of the Allies. Ultimately, it was not the entry of the United States into the war which saw Ribbentrop's influence in the Nazi regime begin to decline. Rather, the decision 6 months earlier by Hitler to tear up the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement and invade the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941 had seen Ribbentrop's influence within the regime decline dramatically. This decision by Hitler to leave Britain undefeated in the West and instead invade Russia in the East went against everything Ribbentrop had worked for since early 1939. To prevent it, the foreign minister had even suggested that Germany should have tried to bring the Soviet Union into the war against Britain on its side. However, Hitler had started to act according to his own ideological desire to destroy the Soviet Union in 1941, where previously in 1939 he had behaved strategically. The result in this change of tactics was disastrous for the Nazi war effort. After several months of initial successes, which brought massive German armies to the outskirts of Moscow and Leningrad, the onslaught stalled in the winter of 1941, and after a calamitous loss at the Battle of Stalingrad the following autumn and winter, the Russians began to push the Germans back towards Poland early in 1943. By that time, it was clear that Germany would eventually lose the war. The events of 1941 and 1942 saw Ribbentrop falling increasingly out of favor with Hitler and losing much of his influence within the Third Reich. His ascendancy since 1939 had been based on the accord with the Soviet Union, and his efforts to preserve the agreement in 1940 and 1941 placed him at odds with Hitler for the first time, a figure that he had ingratiated himself with over the years by always agreeing with his ideas. Moreover, beyond the damage this had caused to his personal relationship with the Führer, the simple fact was that as the war went on, Ribbentrop simply found himself with fewer and fewer opportunities to make an impression on the international stage. As foreign minister, his job was to engage in diplomacy, but by 1942, Germany had severed diplomatic relations with a vast number of countries around the world. Beyond its own allies of Italy, Japan, and the Central European states such as Hungary, it only maintained diplomatic ties with countries such as Ireland, Spain, Switzerland, and Sweden in Europe, which had all remained neutral. As a result, there wasn't an initiative Ribbentrop could engage in to try to rebuild his influence. Moreover, Hitler was said to have found him increasingly tiresome to be around and deliberately tried to avoid meetings with the foreign minister, whom he had once found so affable. Ribbentrop's role in the Holocaust of Europe's Jewish population, which was occurring from 1941 onwards, and indeed his wider attitude towards the Jewish people, has been a matter of some debate. As we have seen, in his earlier life as a wine merchant, Ribbentrop knew and worked with many Jewish business people in Berlin, and indeed in the early days of the Nazi regime in 1933, he had even organized a lunch for some Jewish colleagues to tell them that the expressed anti-Jewish sentiments of the Nazi Party was largely just rhetoric. Yet he soon learned that that was decidedly not the case. As he came to this realization, he started making public expressions of anti-Semitism himself, and, during the war, Ribbentrop was responsible for applying diplomatic pressure through the Foreign Office on places such as Vichy, France, to identify and apprehend any Jewish people living there and send them to the death camps such as Auschwitz and Treblinka across Central and Eastern Europe, where the Nazi regime was engaging in mass murder. Because of the contrast between his earlier relations with the Jewish business community in Germany and his later actions, it is generally believed by historians that Ribbentrop's anti-Semitism was largely feigned in order to ingratiate himself with Hitler. But this matters little when appraising him today. The reality is that, whatever his own personal views, Ribbentrop contributed substantially to the Holocaust through his actions. Von Ribbentrop found himself dispatched to the political wilderness as the war was heading into its final stages. In June 1944, the Western Allies, led by the United States, Britain and Canada, finally opened the long-awaited Western Front with the D-Day landings in northern France. After some resistance, the German hold on France quickly collapsed in August 1944, and by the end of that month, Paris had been liberated, with a separate invasion in the south of the country, resulting in the Germans being pushed out of the entire region. The stage was now set for a push into eastern France in the autumn and then western Germany in the winter. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Russians continued to push the Germans back through Ukraine, the Baltic states, and then Poland. By January 1945, they were amassing their armies in western Poland for the final push towards Berlin in the early spring of 1945. The new year brought a push by both sides to break into Germany as quickly as possible. Yet Hitler would not sanction any talk of surrender, such as might have involved Ribbentrop as the foreign minister. It was simply a race to see if the Russians or the Americans and the British could seize Berlin first. Ribbentrop's final months as German foreign minister led to whatever remaining influence he had completely evaporating. By now, with no diplomatic victories left to be won, he found himself trying to secure Hitler's favor by devoting himself energetically to the Third Reich's genocidal policies, even as it collapsed. This did not have the desired effect, and his star waned even further in the summer of 1944, when many staff of the Foreign Office were implicated in a conspiracy launched by members of the German army to try to kill Hitler and negotiate a surrender to the Allies in July 1944. Ribbentrop was certainly not personally involved, but it reflected poorly on him that individuals with whom he had worked were complicit in the attempted coup. By the closing months of 1944, he was openly derided by some of his colleagues within the government, most of whom had always despised Ribbentrop but had tolerated him as one of Hitler's favored officials. Yet he lost even that in the end. Although Ribbentrop was invited to attend the Chancellor's 56th birthday party in Berlin on the 20th of April 1945, when he requested a personal audience with Hitler a few days later, he was refused and told that Hitler had matters of actual consequence to attend to. By that time, in April 1945, Berlin was surrounded by the Russians, and the Americans and British were rapidly progressing through central Germany, trying to make it to the capital themselves before the war ended, with civilians including boys and elderly men having been armed by the Nazi regime. In an attempt to defend central Berlin, Hitler decided not to fight himself and instead committed suicide in the bunker of the Reichschancellery on the 30th of April 1945. His appointed successor, the propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, killed himself a day later, along with his wife and children. With the war effectively over, the heads of the German government fled Berlin to the north of Germany, to the town of Flensburg on the Danish border, where Allied troops had not yet penetrated. There, the new president of Germany, Admiral Karl Donitz, organized the country's surrender to the Allies, and on the 8th of May 1945, the war in Europe came to an end. Ribbentrop, who had fled north towards Flensburg himself, had offered his services to Donitz, but was rejected. He now found himself a fugitive and, as a leading minister of the Nazi regime, was one of the top targets for apprehension. Consequently, it did not take long to find him, and on the 14th of June 1945, he was arrested in the northern port city of Hamburg. Ribbentrop would now face prosecution as one of the senior members of the regime. The decision had been taken by the Allies prior to the final push towards Berlin that only certain groups within Germany would suffer reprisals for the country's actions during the war. These were largely restricted to senior members of the Nazi Party and regime, and also the SS, the paramilitary organization which had run the concentration camp system across Europe, resulting in the murder of millions of Jews, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and many others. As the German foreign minister from 1938 to 1945, Ribbentrop was scheduled to be tried amongst a group of the leading surviving Nazis. These included Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, Albert Speer, the armaments minister, Wilhelm Keitel, the head of the Wehrmacht and the de facto Minister for Defense for the entire period of the war, and Hans Frank, the head of the General Government of Poland, the Nazi occupation government established in 1939. These were each accused of having contributed to the outbreak of the Second World War and of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity by managing the war and being complicit in the running of the concentration camp system. These individuals went on trial in the German city of Nuremberg late in 1945, so chosen because it was here that the Nazis had held their massive annual rallies during the 1930s. The trial lasted for 11 months. Ribbentrop's counsel attempted to depict him as being a stooge of sorts, a powerless foreign minister whose department was effectively run by Hitler. They also tried to suggest that Ribbentrop himself had been deceived by the claims Hitler made between 1933 and 1939, that he wanted peace in Europe, while allowing Germany to re-establish its dignity. The tribunal rejected these arguments out of hand, claiming it was not plausible that someone as central to the Nazi regime could have been unaware of the aggressive nature of Hitler's plans for Europe. Moreover, they highlighted Ribbentrop's centrality to both the Anschluss of Austria and the events leading to the virtual annexation of Czechoslovakia in late 1938 and early 1939, as well as his absolutely critical role in the events leading up to the invasion of Poland and the outbreak of the war in the autumn of 1939. Thus, when the decisions finally came at Nuremberg in October 1946, Ribbentrop was found guilty on all 4 counts of crimes against peace, planning a war of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Like several others such as Göring, Frank, and Keitel, he was sentenced to death by hanging. The sentences on those who were condemned to death at the first trial at Nuremberg were to be carried out in a block of executions on the 16th of October 1946, just days after the trial concluded. The hangings were to be carried out at the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison using the standard drop method. Many of those who had stood trial with Ribbentrop, such as Speer and Ribbentrop's predecessor as Foreign Minister Constantin von Neurath, had been given custodial sentences and avoided death. Ribbentrop was among a group of 11, which included Frank, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the most senior surviving member of the SS, and Wilhelm Keitel, who were due to be hanged that day. But the number was reduced to 10 when Hermann Göring, the most senior surviving member of the Nazi regime, committed suicide by taking a potassium cyanide capsule on the night of the 15th. As a result, Ribbentrop was the first of the group of 10 to be executed, in a bizarre last act which in no way reflected his personal actions over the previous 12 years. His last words called for the reunification of Germany and declared that, quote, "I wish peace to the world." Afterwards, Ribbentrop's body and those of the other 9 and Göring were taken to the crematorium at Ostfriedhof in Munich and cremated, before their ashes were scattered in the river Isar in southern Bavaria to prevent any graves or monuments to them becoming Nazi shrines. Joachim von Ribbentrop was one of the most peculiar senior members of the Nazi regime. His background was not that of an individual who had encountered professional and personal failures during his youth and, as a result, had become bitter towards society, as was largely the case with Hitler and Joseph Goebbels. Rather, Ribbentrop was a late convert to Nazism, only embracing the party in 1932 on the eve of its ascent to power. Prior to this, he had simply been a dilettante with pretensions to nobility, albeit an individual whose entry into high society was obtained almost entirely through family and marital connections, rather than his own work or talent. Moreover, he displayed no particular ideological bent after 1933. Rather, his senior role within the party was obtained almost entirely through his personal relationship with Hitler. As a sycophant and a yes man, Hitler liked having Ribbentrop around because he simply agreed with whatever he proposed nearly all of the time. It was this relationship which allowed Ribbentrop to rise with great speed within the Nazi hierarchy, first being appointed as ambassador to Britain, and then succeeding as the foreign minister in early 1938. What is most striking about Ribbentrop is that, having been appointed as foreign minister, he managed to score a number of notable successes in his first years in that position, despite his general lack of ability and unpleasant character. He could, for instance, lay claim to some extent to Germany's virtual conquest of Central Europe during the course of 1938 and early 1939, largely through diplomatic agreements such as that reached with Britain at Munich in the autumn of 1938. But surely his greatest success was in negotiating the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with his Russian counterpart. This provided the means for Germany to conquer much of Europe in the 12 months that followed, and had Hitler not decided to scrap the agreement in 1941 and invade Russia, there is a possibility that Germany could have emerged from the war largely victorious. Instead, he did invade Russia, and this, combined with the entry of the United States into the war in December 1941, doomed Germany to military defeat, as diplomatic negotiations became pointless, and as Hitler's view of Ribbentrop declined precipitously. The foreign minister became a peripheral figure in the Nazi regime. Despite all of this, there is no doubting Ribbentrop's complicity in the crimes of the Nazi regime, both in fomenting the war and in committing numerous atrocities, while it is also clear that he knew perfectly well what was occurring at the death camps throughout Europe and facilitated the Holocaust. It was, in the end, entirely fitting that, despite his tepid ideological adherence to Nazism, he was amongst the first leaders of the regime to be prosecuted and found guilty at Nuremberg. What do you think of Joachim von Ribbentrop? Was he an individual who did great harm in fomenting much of the Second World War, or was he simply a sycophant of Hitler's who found himself rising to a position of major power as a result? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.